They took the house. They took the truck. They took the savings account down to the last dollar, split 3 ways at a lawyer's table while their mother sat quiet in a folding chair. Then Gary set the folder down and told her the diner was hers because nobody else wanted it. Not a gift, a leftover. The place her husband had run for 40 years handed to her like a chore nobody could get out of. She said thank you. She did not raise her voice. 3 months later, a tax assessor with a flashlight and an old friendship would find something under that diner's floor, something none of her children had bothered to imagine existed. Let me take you back to the day of the reading. Before any of that, Nora Ann Kessler was 74 years old. She'd buried her husband 9 days earlier. Walter Kessler had run Kessler's Diner on Route 9 for 40 years, out past the bend where the road follows Coldwater Creek through the Blue Ridge foothills of Mill Haven Ridge, North Carolina. He had died the way he lived, quietly, at the counter, closing up for the night. It had taken Nora 3 tries to find his reading glasses in the dark before she could call anyone. The lawyer's office smelled like new carpet and old coffee. Nora sat between her daughter Deborah and a window that let in too much winter light. Across the table sat her sons, Gary and Todd, both grown, both comfortable, both wearing the kind of quiet impatience men wear when they've already decided how a meeting is going to end before it starts. The lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Hollis, read through the will in a flat, careful voice. The house on Larkin Street, split 3 ways among the children, already listed with a realtor before Walter was even in the ground. The truck, going to Todd, who'd always wanted it. The savings, $41,000, split evenly. And the diner. The diner and its parcel of land, Hollis read, to my wife, Nora Ann Kessler, for her use and benefit. Silence. The specific kind that happens when nobody quite wants to be the one to say what everyone's thinking. Well, Gary said finally, closing his own folder with a small, decisive snap. That works out fine, actually. Mum, the diner's yours. Nobody else really wanted it anyway. It hasn't turned a profit in 6 years, Gary, Todd added, not unkindly. Just factually, the way you'd note a fact about weather. It's basically a write-off at this point. We already split the advance on the house sale, Deborah said, glancing at her brothers for confirmation. It seemed fair. You get the diner, we split the rest. You don't even have to keep it open, Mum. You could sell the land for whatever it's worth and just rest. Nora looked at the 3 of them, one at a time. Deborah in her good coat, the one that cost more than the diner's monthly gas bill. Gary checking his watch, already thinking about the drive back to Charlotte. Todd, the youngest, looking at least a little uncomfortable, though not uncomfortable enough to say anything different. Thank you, Nora said. That was all. 2 words flat and even, the same tone she'd used 40 years of taking orders at a counter. None of her children caught what was underneath them. She did not raise her voice. She did not remind them that she had worked that diner's counter every single day her husband ran the grill, that she had raised all 3 of them on tips and eggs and Walter's mechanic work in the bay, out back, that she had never once in 74 years been handed anything she hadn't earned first with her own 2 hands. She simply folded her own copy of the will, put it in her purse, thanked her children for giving her the one thing that had actually been hers all along. The meeting ended the way these meetings end. Hugs that didn't quite reach all the way around. Promises to call more that everyone already half suspected wouldn't be kept. Deborah drove back to Asheville. Todd took the truck for a test drive he didn't need. Gary shook Hollis's hand and mentioned, almost as an afterthought on his way out the door, that he hoped the realtor could move the Larkin Street house fast. Interest rates being what they were, Nora drove herself home in her own car, the one Walter had bought her second-hand 11 years ago. She did not go to the empty house on Larkin Street that would soon belong to a stranger. She drove straight to the diner. It sat where it had always sat, at the bend in the Route 9 where the road curves along Coldwater Creek. A low building with a faded red roof, and a sign that had said Kessler's in the same yellow paint since before any of her children were born. The gravel lot was empty, except for her own car and old Pete Ambrose's truck, parked crooked the way it had been parked crooked for 30 years. She let herself in with the key she'd carried on her ring since she was 25 years old. The lights came on with their familiar flicker. The griddle sat cold. The counter stools, red vinyl gone thin at the seams, waited in their same crooked row. Pete Ambrose was standing at the window, hat in his hands. the way men of a certain generation stand when they don't quite know what to do with grief that isn't their own to carry. Figured you'd come by, Pete said. Where else would I go, Pete? Diner opens tomorrow. Nora looked around the room Walter had built with his own hands, the counter he'd bolted down himself, the grill he'd cleaned every night for 40 years without fail, rain or shine, sickness or health. She felt something settle in her chest that was steadier than grief and older than exhaustion. Diner opens tomorrow, she said. Same time as always, 4 a.m. Pete nodded like that was the only sensible answer in the world and let himself out into the cold. Nora stood alone in the diner a long while after he'd gone. She ran her hand along the counter's edge, feeling the worn groove Walter's forearms had cut into the wood over 4 decades of leaning there, taking orders, telling jokes, running the only business either of them had ever known. Her children thought they'd handed her a burden. They had no idea they'd handed her the only thing in the world she actually wanted to hold on to. She was at the diner by 3:45 the next morning, same as she had been most mornings of her adult life, unlocking the door in the dark, flipping on lights that buzzed and flickered before catching. She lit the griddle. She ground coffee the old way, in the machine Walter had refused to replace even when the newer models came out. Because he said this one still worked, and there wasn't any sense throwing away something that still did its job. By 5, Pete Ambrose was back. Same stool, same order. 2 eggs over easy and dry wheat toast, no butter, doctor's orders he ignored every other day of the week. By 6, 3 more regulars had wandered in, drawn less by hunger than by the simple fact that the lights were on and the smell of coffee was drifting out over the gravel lot same as it always had. Didn't know if you'd keep her running, Nora, said Delphine Ott, who'd been coming in every Tuesday and Thursday since 1988. Figured maybe you'd want a rest. I've had plenty of rest lying awake at night, Nora said, sliding a plate of hash browns across the counter. This is easier. She did not tell Delphine or Pete or any of the regulars filing in that morning exactly what her children had said at the reading, exactly how they'd divided things up, exactly how it had felt to be handed the one thing nobody else wanted, like it was a consolation prize instead of a legacy. She kept that folded up small and put away, the way she'd learned to keep most hard things folded up small over 49 years of marriage and motherhood. She poured coffee. She flipped eggs. She let the diner's ordinary rhythm carry her through the first hard week of being a widow, with 3 grown children who'd already moved on to dividing up what was left of their father. The diner's books were not good, and Nora knew that better than anyone. She'd kept half of them herself for the last decade, while Walter's hands got too shaky to manage the register at the end of long days. 6 years of thin margins, a roof that needed patching, a walk-in cooler running on borrowed time, the mechanic's bay out back, closed since Walter's hip surgery 3 years earlier, sitting dark and unused, full of old tools nobody had touched since. She did the math late one night at the kitchen table, in the empty house on Larkin Street, the last week before the sale closed and she'd have to be out. The numbers were not encouraging. The diner brought in just enough to cover its own light bill and payroll for the one part-time cook, Ruthie, who'd been with them 11 years. There was nothing left over. There hadn't been anything left over in longer than Nora wanted to admit. But there was something else in that house. Something Nora found while packing up the last of Walter's things from the hall closet. A manila envelope tucked behind a box of old Christmas ornaments, his handwriting on the front in pencil, faded but legible. Diner. Deed and survey, it said. Keep separate. She almost didn't open it that night. Tired as she was, boxes stacked to the ceiling around her, the house already starting to feel like somebody else's. But something about Walter's handwriting, the careful way he'd underlined keep separate twice, made her sit down at the kitchen table, one more time, and slide the envelope's contents out into the lamplight. Inside was the diner's deed, familiar, the one she'd signed alongside Walter decades ago. Beneath it, older, yellowed at the edges, a survey map from 1961, the kind the county used to draw out old parcels by hand before everything went digital. Nora spread it flat on the table and studied it the way she used to study report cards and grocery bills. Carefully, line by line, looking for what she wasn't quite sure of yet. The diner's lot was outlined in faded blue ink, a neat rectangle running back from the road to the edge of Coldwater Creek. But there at the back corner, closest to the water, was a second shape, drawn in a different hand, in different ink. A narrow strip of land marked with a small notation. She had to hold the paper up to the lamp to read clearly. Parcel B, separate title. E. Kessler. E. Kessler. Elias Kessler. Walter's father, dead now for over 30 years. The man who'd built the very first version of this business back when it was nothing but a filling station and 2 gas pumps on a dirt road nobody paved until 1954. Nora sat with that survey a long time that night, turning it over in her hands. She did not understand yet what it meant. She only understood, in the way a person understands weather before a storm arrives, that there was more sitting quietly underneath her ordinary exhausted life than she had known to look for. She folded the survey carefully back into its envelope. She carried it with her, the next morning, out to the diner. She set it in the drawer beneath the register, where she kept the things that mattered most, next to Walter's reading glasses and the photograph of their wedding day. She did not mention it to Deborah or Gary or Todd. Some things she had learned over 74 years are worth understanding fully yourself before you hand them to anyone else to misunderstand. The winter passed slow and cold, the way winters do in the foothills. Nora ran the diner the way she'd always run it, 4 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. Closed Mondays, same as Walter had always kept it. Ruthie worked the grill. On the days Nora's hands ached too much to stand over it herself, Pete Ambrose ate his eggs and toast without fail. And slowly, over weeks, other regulars started drifting back in too, people who'd quietly stopped coming the last couple years when Walter's health had made the place feel uncertain. Business did not improve much. The math stayed the same thin, worrying math it had always been. But something in Nora steadied that winter, the way a person steadies once the worst thing that could happen has already happened. And there's nothing left to do but keep moving forward, one plate of eggs at a time. It was late February when the storage room floor started giving her trouble. A hard week of rain had come through, the kind that turns Coldwater Creek loud and brown. Nora noticed the linoleum in the back storage room had started to bow, just slightly near the far wall. Probably the creek's backing up under the foundation, Ruthie said, when Nora pointed it out. Old buildings do that. Walter never mentioned water getting under there. Walter never mentioned a lot of things. Bless him, Ruthie said. Not unkindly. Man kept half this place's secrets in his own head and never wrote a word of it down. Nora thought about the envelope in the drawer beneath the register, the survey with its second unexplained parcel, and said nothing. She got down on her knees that evening after closing, alone in the storage room with a flashlight, pressed her palm flat against the bowed linoleum. It gave slightly under her hand, more than old flooring over solid ground should give. She worked her fingers under the edge where it had lifted from the baseboard and pulled. The linoleum came up easier than she expected, in one long brittle strip, revealing a warped wooden panel beneath it, old plywood gone soft and swollen at the edges. And beneath one corner of that panel, where the wood had pulled away from whatever it was resting on, was a gap. Dark. Cool air moving up out of it, carrying a smell of old earth and mineral water that had nothing to do with rain backing up under a foundation. Nora sat back on her heels and stared at that gap a long moment, flashlight beam catching motes of dust drifting up out of the darkness beneath her diner's floor. She did not pry the panel up further that night. Her knees ached, and the hour was late, and some things she had learned deserved daylight and a second pair of eyes before you go looking at them too closely. She laid the linoleum strip back down loosely over the gap, turned off the lights and locked up. She thought about that dark space beneath the floor, the whole drive home to the small rented house she'd moved into after the Larkin Street sale closed. The annual property reassessment notice arrived in the mail 3 days later, the kind of ordinary county paperwork that usually went straight into a drawer unread. But this year, reading the letterhead, Nora recognised the name printed beneath the county seal. Earl Whitcomb, Rowan County Tax Assessor. She had not seen Earl in years, not since Walter's memorial service, where he'd stood at the back of the small crowd in his good coat and shaken her hand a long moment without saying much of anything, the way old army friends sometimes do when words feel too small for what they're trying to hold. Earl and Walter had served together decades earlier, before either of them had settled into the quiet lives they'd eventually built in Millhaven Ridge. Though they hadn't been close in recent years, there had always been a kind of steady respect between them that never needed much upkeep. Nora called the county office and scheduled the reassessment for the following Tuesday, the diner's slow day, so Earl could walk the property without customers underfoot. He arrived a little after 10, silver-haired now, walking with the careful gait of a man whose knees had given him trouble for longer than he'd admit to. He shook Nora's hand at the door, held it a beat longer than a stranger would, looked around the diner's dining room with the particular fondness of someone remembering a place from a different decade of his own life. "Sorry about Walter," Earl said. "I should have said more at the service. Didn't have the words that day." "Nobody ever does, Earl." "It's all right. Man built a good life out here, not flashy. Just good." Earl set his clipboard down on the counter and pulled out a folded survey map of his own, newer than the one in Nora's drawer, but drawn from the same old county records. "Now, I hate to make this visit all business, but the county's redoing parcel assessments county-wide this year. First real update since the digital system went in. I need to walk the footprint and confirm the boundaries match what's on file." "Of course," Nora said. "Whatever you need." They walked the diner's perimeter together, Earl measuring here and there with a laser tool that beeped softly, jotting figures onto his clipboard, comparing them against the digitized map on a tablet he carried under one arm. It was slow, unremarkable work, the kind of task that fills most of a county assessor's ordinary week. Nora walked alongside him mostly out of politeness, half her mind still on the morning's breakfast rush. It was around the back of the building, near the old mechanic's bay, that Earl stopped walking and frowned down at his tablet. "Huh," he said. "What is it? This footprint's never sat right with me," Earl said, more to himself than to her, tapping the screen. "I flagged this same parcel back when I first started this job. Must be 20 years ago now. The digitized boundary the county's got on file runs the diner's lot right up to the creek. But the original 1961 survey, the paper one in the old archive, shows a notch cut out of the northeast corner. A separate little strip that never got folded into the main parcel when everything went digital in the 90s. Nora's chest went still and quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the cold February air. "A separate strip," she repeated. "Probably nothing," Earl said, waving a hand, the way people do when they're trying to be reassuring about something they don't fully understand themselves yet. Happens more than you'd think with these old rural properties. Somebody split off a sliver of land back in the 50s or 60s for one reason or another. Never bothered updating the county map. It just sits there in the old paper records, technically separate, practically forgotten. I've seen it maybe a dozen times in 20 years on the job. Do you know whose name would be on something like that? If it was never merged?" Earl looked up from his tablet, studying her face for a moment, in a way that told Nora he'd caught something in her voice she hadn't quite managed to keep out of it. "Whoever last held clean title to it, if it was never sold or transferred," Earl said slowly. "Why do you ask, Nora? You know something about this, I don't." Nora considered for a moment, keeping the envelope in the drawer to herself a little longer. But Earl Whitcomb had known Walter for 40 years, had stood quiet and respectful at his memorial when words failed him. Something about his careful, patient way of asking made her decide, standing there in the cold behind her husband's diner, that this was exactly the kind of thing worth trusting to a second pair of eyes. "Come inside a minute," she said. "There's something I want to show you." Earl followed her in through the back door, past the storage room where the linoleum still lay loose over the gap she hadn't finished investigating. Nora made a small, deliberate point of not mentioning that yet. One discovery at a time, she thought. She wasn't sure why the instinct came so strongly, only that it felt right, the way certain instincts had felt right her whole life, without needing much explanation. She pulled the envelope from the drawer beneath the register and set it on the counter between them, slid out the old 1961 survey, spreading it flat under the diner's fluorescent lights. Earl leaned over it a long moment silent, his weathered finger tracing the faded blue outline of the diner's main parcel, then moving to the second shape at the back corner, the one marked in the different ink. "Parcel B," he read aloud. Separate title. E. Kessler. He looked up at her. "This is Elias's hand, isn't it? Walter's father." "I believe so. I found it in Walter's things, packing up the house." He'd written "keep separate" on the envelope, underlined it twice. Earl was quiet a moment, studying the old paper the way a man studies something he's beginning to suspect matters more than it looks like it should. "Nora, if this is accurate, and if this parcel was never formally merged into the diner's main lot when Elias passed, then legally speaking, it may never have entered probate as part of Walter's estate at all. It would have just sat there, separate, waiting on whoever holds clean title to it now. And who would that be? That, Earl said, is exactly what the county records office is going to need to sort out. But if Elias never sold it, never gifted it, never formally transferred it to Walter while he was alive, it was never merged into the diner's parcel on any recorded deed. He trailed off, tapping the paper. It's possible this strip of land is still sitting in Elias Kessler's name, 30-some years after his death, just waiting for somebody to notice. Nora felt something turn over slowly in her chest. Not excitement exactly. Not yet. More a kind of careful, wary attention, the way you'd watch a pot that might be about to boil over. What would that mean for me? Depends on the chain, Earl said. If Elias left no other heirs besides Walter, and Walter's the only one who ever occupied or maintained that land as part of running this diner, there's a reasonable argument that title passes through Walter's line, regardless of what the will divided up. But that's a question for a title attorney and the county recorder, not for me standing here with a clipboard. He folded the survey carefully back along its old creases. I'd like to bring this to the archive office myself, if you'll let me. Pull the original 1961 filing. Confirm exactly what's recorded and what isn't. I owe your husband that much. And then some. I'd appreciate that, Earl. He was halfway to the door, survey tucked carefully under one arm, when Nora stopped him with a hand on the counter. There's one more thing, she said. Before you go, I found something in the storage room a few nights back. I haven't looked at it properly yet. I was going to wait for daylight and another set of hands. Earl's eyebrows went up slightly. What kind of something? Come see for yourself. She led him back through the kitchen to the storage room, where the linoleum still lay loose over the gap in the corner, exactly as she'd left it. Earl crouched down slowly, knees complaining audibly, and peeled the linoleum back the rest of the way, revealing the full warped panel beneath. This wood's old, he said, running a hand along the swollen plywood. Older than the diner's current flooring, I'd guess. Might be original to whatever stood here before Walter built this building out. The gas station, Nora said quietly. Elias's filling station. That's what stood here first. Earl looked up at her, and something passed between them, an understanding neither one of them needed to say out loud yet. He worked his fingers under the edge of the panel, where the wood had pulled loose, and together carefully, they lifted it back. Beneath it was not simply a gap or a crawl space, as Nora had half expected, but the top few steps of a narrow stairwell, cut straight down into packed earth and old fieldstone, disappearing into darkness that smelled of cool mineral water, and something older, mustier, undisturbed for decades. Well, Earl said softly, staring down into it, that's not a plumbing leak. Nora crouched at the edge, flashlight in hand, and shone the beam down the stairwell. The light caught old stone walls, carefully mortared, the work of a man who'd clearly built the space to last. At the bottom, perhaps 8 feet down, she could make out the shape of a small room, no bigger than the storage closet above it. Something square and dark sitting against the far wall. Looks like an old storm cellar, Earl said. Folks built these back in the 50s, before proper basements were common out this way. Somewhere to shelter during bad weather, keep root vegetables cool in summer. Whole families used to dig these by hand. Walter never once mentioned a cellar under this diner in 40 years, Nora said. Not once. Maybe Walter never knew it was here, Earl said slowly. Or maybe he knew exactly what was down there, and exactly why his father told him to keep it separate. Nora looked at the narrow stairs a long moment, feeling the same steady, careful attention settle over her that had carried her through 9 days of grief and a lawyer's office, and a winter of 4 a.m. mornings, at a griddle that had outlived her husband. I'm going down there, she said. Nora, those stairs haven't held weight in who knows how long. Let me go first. Earl Whitcomb, I have been climbing in and out of a walk-in cooler with a bad hip for 6 years. I believe I can manage a staircase my own father-in-law built with his hands. Earl almost smiled, despite himself, despite the strange gravity of the moment. Fair enough. But I'm right behind you. She went down slowly, one careful step at a time, testing each stone tread with her weight, before committing to it. Flashlight beam swinging ahead of her into the dark. The air grew cooler with each step, mineral and damp, carrying a faint mustiness that spoke of decades sealed away from daylight. At the bottom, her feet found solid packed earth, and she straightened, turning the flashlight beam around the small stone room. Shelves lined one wall, empty now except for a few cracked mason jars their contents long since gone to dust, and against the far wall, exactly where she glimpsed it from above, sat a small metal trunk, rusted at the corners, its latch closed but not locked. Nora crossed the small room and knelt before it, Earl's careful footsteps arriving behind her a moment later. "Go on," Earl said quietly. "It's yours to open, Nora. Whatever's in there." She worked the rusted latch with careful fingers, and after a moment's resistance, it gave. The trunk's lid creaked open on hinges that hadn't moved in decades. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, were a set of leather-bound ledgers, their spines cracked, their pages yellowed but legible. Nora lifted the top one carefully and opened it under the flashlight's beam. Careful, cramped handwriting filled the pages, columns of dates and figures stretching back to 1958. "Fuel sales," Earl said, leaning close, reading over her shoulder. "Tyre repairs, oil changes. This is a service ledger from the original filling station." "Elias's handwriting," Nora said softly, recognizing it from the survey map upstairs. The same careful, deliberate hand. Beneath the ledgers, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth, was a single folded document, thicker paper than the ledger pages, official-looking even beneath its age. Nora's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, and Earl held the flashlight steady over her shoulder so she could read. It was a deed, dated 1961, the same year as the survey upstairs, filed with the county recorder's office, complete with an official stamp gone faint with age but still legible, and the name on it, clear as the day it was written, was Elias Kessler. "This is the original title to Parcel B," Earl said, his voice low with something between awe and disbelief. "Nora, this was never transferred. Never sold. It's been sitting down here since 1961. Beneath the deed, tucked into the trunk's corner, was a small folded note. The paper different from the ledger pages. Softer. More worn. As though it had been folded and unfolded many times before finally being put away for good. Nora lifted it out with careful fingers and unfolded it under the light. The handwriting matched the ledgers, matched the deed, matched the survey. Elias Kessler's hand, unmistakable now that she'd seen it 3 times over. The lot under her feet was never the diner's to give away. It read, "Whoever runs this place with their whole heart will find it when the time is right. Not before." Nora read the line twice, then a third time, her flashlight beam trembling slightly against the old paper. "Earl," she said quietly, "I don't think Elias meant for Walter to find this at all. I think he meant for whoever was still standing here, still running this place, decades later, to be the one to find it." "Your father-in-law," Earl said slowly, buried a deed and a note under his own filling station. Left instructions for it to surface only when the right person was still here to receive it. "He couldn't have known it would be me," Nora said. "He died when Walter was barely 30. He never lived to see who I'd become." "Maybe not," Earl said, "but he clearly knew something about how these things tend to work out. The ones who keep showing up, keep doing the work, keep the lights on, those are usually the ones who end up holding what actually matters sooner or later." They carried the trunk up out of the cellar together, careful on the old stone stairs. Set it on the storage room floor, in the grey afternoon light filtering through the diner's back window. Earl photographed the deed, the survey, the note. Everything. Methodical and careful, the way a man who'd spent 20 years in county records naturally was. "I need to take this to the archive office," he said. "Confirm the filing, check whether any subsequent transfer exists that we don't know about. If not, start the process of establishing clear title. This isn't going to happen overnight, Nora. County processes like this can take weeks, sometimes longer." "I've got time, Earl. I've got a diner to run in the meantime." "That you do." He hesitated at the door, the trunk's photographed contents saved carefully to his tablet, the original documents left with Nora at her insistence, since they were, after all, found on her property. "Nora, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it plain. Your husband built a good, quiet life out here. Never made much noise about it. But it seems like his father built something into the bones of this place that's been waiting a very long time. For the right person to find it. I don't think that's an accident." "No," Nora said, looking around the diner. At the counter, Walter had bolted down himself. The grill he'd cleaned every night for 40 years. The mechanic's bay gone quiet since his hip surgery. The storage room floor now gaping open onto a cellar that had kept its secret for over 60 years. "I don't believe it's an accident either." The weeks that followed moved slower than Nora had patience for. Still, She kept the diner running the same steady rhythm regardless. 4 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. 6 days a week. Closed Mondays. Earl called every few days with small updates. Mostly bureaucratic. Mostly frustrating in the particular way old county records could be frustrating. Buried in filing cabinets that hadn't been properly indexed since before either of them were born. Ruthie noticed Nora's distraction before anyone else did. "You've had your mind somewhere else lately," Ruthie said, one slow Wednesday afternoon, wiping down the counter. "Ever since Earl Whitcomb came around with his clipboard. Something going on you want to talk about?" Nora considered how much to say, weighing Ruthie's 11 years of loyalty against her own long habit of keeping things folded up small until she understood them fully herself. "There's an old parcel of land behind the diner," Nora said finally. "Might be separate from the rest of the property. Might have never actually belonged to the estate my children divided up." Ruthie's eyebrows rose slowly. "Might belong to just you mean?" "Might. We don't know yet. Does Deborah know? All the boys?" "Not yet," Nora said. "There's no sense telling them something might exist when I don't yet know for certain that it does." Ruthie studied her a long moment. The same careful, appraising look she gave a piece of meat before deciding whether it was worth cooking. "You're not planning on telling them at all until it's settled, are you?" "I'm planning on telling them exactly when it's the right time to tell them," Nora said. "Not a moment before." In the weeks while the county's paperwork moved at its own slow pace, Nora spent her evenings learning what she could about Elias Kessler, beyond the careful handwriting in his ledgers. She drove out one Saturday afternoon to the small county historical society, housed in the old courthouse annex, a cramped, dusty room run by a retired schoolteacher named Miss Agnes Prather, lit up with genuine delight when Nora explained who she was looking for. "Elias Kessler," Miss Prather repeated, already moving toward a filing cabinet in the back corner. "Built that filling station out on Route 9, didn't he? Right at the bend by the creek. My father used to buy his gas there, back before I was old enough to drive myself. You remember him?" "Only stories, dear. I was a small child. But my father always said Elias Kessler was the kind of man who'd fix your flat tire for free if you looked like you were having a hard week. Never once mention it again afterward." Miss Prather pulled a thin folder from the cabinet, blowing a light layer of dust from its cover. "We've got a few old newspaper clippings. Not much. Small-town papers didn't cover much beyond church socials and football scores back then, unless something went wrong. The clippings were brief, yellowed, mostly announcements. The filling station's grand opening in 1954, a single paragraph noting Elias Kessler as proprietor, his young wife Ida standing beside him in the accompanying photograph, both of them squinting into the sun. A notice from 1958 announcing the addition of a small diner counter to the station, for travellers wanting a hot meal along with their fill-up. And finally a brief obituary from 1991, 4 sentences long, noting only that Elias Kessler, longtime proprietor of Kessler's on Route 9, had passed peacefully at home. Survived by his son Walter and daughter-in-law Nora, Nora read that last clipping twice, feeling the strange, quiet weight of seeing her own name printed in a stranger's obituary from over 30 years earlier, a small permanent record of a connection she'd never fully appreciated until now. "He doesn't seem to have left much of a paper trail," Nora said. "Some men don't need one," Miss Prather said. "Some men just build something quiet and solid and let the building speak for itself, long after they're gone. Sounds like your father-in-law might have been exactly that kind." Nora thanked her and drove back to the diner with the thin folder of clippings on the passenger seat, feeling, for the first time since Walter's death, a sense of continuity stretching backward through decades she'd only ever seen the edges of. She had married into this family thinking she understood its whole shape. She was only now, in her 75th year, beginning to understand how much of that shape had been built quietly, patiently, by a man who died before she'd ever had the chance to properly know him. Deborah called unexpectedly that same week, on a Wednesday evening, her voice carrying an unusual note of hesitation. "Mom, I keep thinking about the diner, about Dad and Grandpa Elias. How little I actually know about either of them beyond the surface stuff. Would you tell me more sometime?" "Not because of the land, just because I realise I never really asked." Nora sat with that request a long moment, surprised by how much it moved her, this small, ordinary gesture from a daughter who'd spent the last several months mostly absent, mostly distracted by her own busy life. "I'd like that very much, Deborah," she said. "Come by this weekend. I'll tell you everything I know." Deborah did come by that weekend, sitting at the counter for 2 full hours on a slow Sunday afternoon, listening as Nora walked her through what little she'd learned, the newspaper clippings, the ledgers, the photograph of young Walter standing proud beside the gas pumps in overalls too big for him. Nora did not yet mention the deed, or the note, or the parcel's value, holding that particular truth close a little longer, waiting for the county's paperwork to finish its slow, careful work before she handed her children something they couldn't yet fully understand the weight of. "I never knew Dad grew up working a gas station," Deborah said, studying the old photograph. "He never talked about it much. Just said he grew up helping his father with the business, like it was something ordinary and unremarkable." "Your father wasn't much for talking about himself," Nora said. "He let his work speak for him, same as his father did, from what I'm learning." "I want Claire and her brother to know this," Deborah said, "about where we actually come from. I don't think I've done a good job passing that down." "It's never too late to start," Nora said. "Your grandfather seemed to believe that better than anyone." It was 6 weeks after that afternoon in the cellar, an ordinary Tuesday morning, rain coming down steady outside the diner's front windows. Earl Whitcomb walked in with a folder under his arm. He wore an expression Nora had learned to recognise over the last month and a half, his careful, deliberate way of holding something important close to his chest until he was ready to set it down properly. He sat at the counter, waited for a lull between customers, and finally slid the folder across to her. "County recorder confirmed it," he said. "Parcel B was surveyed in 1961, deeded to Elias Kessler the same year, and never merged into the diner's main parcel when the digital records were established in the 90s. It sat there, technically separate, all this time. Nobody caught it because nobody was looking. Old rural parcels like this fall through the cracks more often than the county would like to admit. And the chain of title. Elias Kessler died intestate in 1991. No formal will on file. Walter was his only surviving child. So under North Carolina law, whatever real property Elias held at his death would have passed to Walter by intestate succession, regardless of whether it was ever formally probated at the time. Since it never surfaced, it never went through probate. It just sat there, quietly, in legal limbo, still technically Elias's on paper, but legally belonging to Walter the moment his father died. Nora felt her chest tighten slightly. "And when Walter died?" "That's the part that matters most for you," Earl said. "Since this parcel was never merged with the diner's main lot, it was never part of the estate your children divided up at the will reading. It wasn't ever on anyone's radar as an asset to divide, which means, under the law, it would pass through Walter's estate separately, according to the same rules of intestate succession that applied when his own father died, unless the will specifically addressed it. The will only mentioned the diner and its parcel of land," Nora said slowly, remembering Hollis's flat, careful reading in that lawyer's office months earlier. "It didn't mention any second parcel, because nobody knew it existed." "Exactly. Which means, as far as the county's concerned, and as far as the title attorney I consulted this week believes, that parcel passes to you directly as Walter's surviving spouse, entirely separate from anything your children received. It was never part of what they split. It couldn't have been. Nobody could divide up something nobody knew was there." Nora sat with that a long moment, rain drumming steady against the diner's windows, the smell of coffee and bacon grease settling familiar and warm around her. "How much is it worth, Earl?" "The land itself." Earl hesitated, glancing down at his folder. "That's the other thing I came to tell you. The county's been quietly rezoning a stretch of the Coldwater Creek frontage for small commercial use, part of a corridor plan they've been working on for the last 2 years. Your parcel sits right in the middle of that rezoned stretch. Quarter-acre, prime creek frontage, zoned now for exactly the kind of expansion a business like yours might want to make." He named a figure, careful and precise, the way he named all figures, and Nora had to set her coffee cup down to keep her hands steady. "That's more than the whole rest of the estate combined," she said quietly. "It is," Earl agreed, "by a fair margin." Nora did not say anything for a long moment. She looked out at the gravel lot through the rain-streaked window, at Pete Ambrose's crooked parked truck, at the diner sign her husband had painted the same yellow every few years without fail so it would never fade, into the background of the road it sat beside. "You all right, Nora?" Earl asked gently. I'm thinking about how my children stood in that lawyer's office and told me I could sell this place for whatever it was worth and just rest, Nora said. Like resting was the only thing I had left to look forward to. Like this place was a burden instead of a life. Are you angry with them? Nora considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things, turning it over before answering. Not angry, she said finally. Tired, maybe. Tired of being the one everyone assumes has nothing left to offer, just because I'm 74 and my husband's gone, and I still choose to get up at 4 in the morning and do the work I know how to do. For what it's worth, Earl said, I don't think you have nothing left to offer. I think you're about to prove exactly the opposite, whether your children are ready to see it or not. Nora almost smiled at that, a small tired curve at the corner of her mouth that hadn't shown itself much since the funeral. What happens next, procedurally speaking? Title attorney files a quiet title action, formalises your ownership on record, clears up any lingering ambiguity from the old paperwork. Should take another few weeks. After that, the parcel's yours, clean and clear, no question about it. You can do whatever you'd like with it. Sell it, develop it, let it sit exactly as it is. I know exactly what I'd like to do with it, Nora said. I've known since the moment you told me what it was worth. What's that? Build a deck, out over the creek frontage, somewhere Walter's regulars can sit on a summer evening and watch the water go by while they eat their supper. Somewhere Elias's old filling station customers would have recognised if they were still around to see it. Earl nodded slowly, something like quiet respect settling into his weathered face. Your father-in-law would have liked that plan, I expect. I expect he would too. The next several weeks passed in the particular blend of ordinary and extraordinary that Nora was slowly learning to live inside. Mornings at the griddle, same as always. Afternoons on the phone with Earl, or with the title attorney his office had recommended, a careful young woman named Patricia Ford, who handled the quiet title filing with brisk, reassuring competence. Evenings alone in the small rented house, going back through Elias's old ledgers page by page, learning the shape of a man she'd never met through the careful record he'd kept of every gallon of gas sold and every tyre patched, 60 years gone. She found, tucked into the back pages of the last ledger, a handful of loose photographs, brittle and curling at the edges. A young man she recognised immediately as Walter, no older than 8 or 9, standing proud beside the gas pumps in overalls too big for him, grinning at whoever held the camera. Elias himself in a few of the photographs, a tall, serious-looking man, with Walter's same steady eyes standing beside the same pumps, one hand resting on his son's small shoulder. Nora studied those photographs a long time, feeling something warm settle over the grief that had been sitting cold in her chest since Walter's death. She'd married into this family's story 50 years after it started, had raised 3 children inside a legacy she'd only ever seen the surface of. Now, in the quiet aftermath of losing the man who'd connected her to all of it, she was finding the deeper roots of that story for the first time, dug up out of a cellar that had waited 60 years for someone to need them. She did not call Deborah, or Gary, or Todd during those weeks. Part of her recognised this as a kind of quiet withholding she wasn't entirely proud of. But a larger part of her recognised it as necessary, the same way you don't hand a child a hot dish straight off the stove before it's had time to cool enough to be held safely. It was Ruthie in the end who asked the question Nora had been avoiding answering, even to herself. When are you going to tell your kids, Nora, about the land? When it's settled. Clean title, no ambiguity. Nothing left for anyone to argue about. And when it's settled, Ruthie pressed, wiping down the same stretch of counter she'd already wiped twice. What then? You going to just mention it over the phone, casual as you please, or you got something else in mind? Nora considered that question a long while, looking out at the gravel lot, at the mechanic's bay standing dark and quiet since Walter's hip surgery, at the storage room door behind which a staircase now sat, its secret finally brought up into daylight. I think, Nora said slowly, I'd like them to hear it here. In this diner, the same place they stood and told me it was basically a write-off. I think there's something fitting about that. You planning some kind of scene, Nora Kessler? Ruthie asked, half amused, half approving. I'm planning the truth, Nora said. Where it happens to land is just a matter of good timing. The quiet title action moved through the county court system over the following month. Slower than Nora would have liked, but steady. Each small procedural step came reported to her by Patricia Ford in brief professional phone calls. The tone gradually shifted from cautious to confident as the filing progressed unopposed. Nobody contested the claim. Nobody could, since nobody besides Nora, Earl, and Patricia even knew the parcel existed yet. In the meantime, Earl came by the diner more often than his job strictly required, ostensibly to check on paperwork progress, but really, Nora suspected, because he'd missed the particular comfort of a diner counter and good coffee since his own wife had passed some years back. He and Pete Ambrose fell into an easy friendship over shared eggs and shared decades of small-town memory. Nora found herself grateful, in a quiet way she hadn't expected, for the small community that had assembled itself around her in the months since Walter's death, filling in some of the space her own children's distance had left behind. Pete Ambrose, for his part, had his own quiet way of showing solidarity that spring, arriving a little earlier than usual most mornings, staying a little later than his eggs and toast strictly required, filling the diner's early hours with easy conversation that asked nothing of Nora beyond her presence behind the counter. "You know I buried my own wife 11 years back," Pete told her one grey morning in March, apropos of nothing, stirring sugar into coffee he never actually needed sweetened. "My kids moved off to Charlotte and Atlanta not long after. Good kids, mind you. Just busy, same as yours. I used to sit in my own kitchen some mornings wondering what exactly I was supposed to do with the rest of my life, now that the person who needed me most wasn't there needing me anymore." "What did you decide?" Nora asked, refilling his cup though he hadn't finished the first. "Decided this counter needed a regular more than my kitchen table needed company," Pete said. "Been showing up here near every morning since. Doesn't fix the loneliness entirely, but it gives the days a shape worth getting up for." "I understand that better than I did a year ago," Nora said. "I figured you might, one of these days." Pete studied her a moment, the particular careful attention of an old friend who'd watched more of her life unfold from that same stool than either of them had ever quite acknowledged out loud. "You seem steadier lately, Nora. Since Earl started coming around with his clipboard, whatever's going on, it's doing you some good." "There's a lot going on, Pete," Nora admitted. "More than I can properly explain yet. But yes, it's doing me some good." "That's all I need to hear," Pete said, and went back to his eggs, asking nothing further. The particular gift of an old friend who trusted her to share the rest whenever she was ready. "Your kids call much?" Earl asked one slow Thursday morning, when the rush had cleared and only Pete remained at his usual stool. "Deborah calls Sundays, the boys less often." Nora poured more coffee, unhurried. "They're not bad children, Earl. They're just busy in the particular way people get busy when they've decided their parents' lives don't require much of their attention anymore." "Doesn't make it right," Pete put in, from his stool. "Man raises 3 kids, works himself half to death keeping a diner running 40 years. They can't be bothered to call more than once a week." "It is what it is, Pete," Nora said. "I raised them to build their own lives. Can't complain too hard when they went and did exactly that." But even as she said it, evenly, without much heat behind the words, Nora felt the old ache underneath it. The specific loneliness of being loved carelessly by people who'd once needed her for everything, and now needed her for almost nothing at all. It was not a new feeling. It had been building slowly for years, long before Walter's death, long before the will reading, a slow accumulation of missed birthdays and short phone calls and holiday visits that ended earlier each year. What was new, she realised, standing at that counter on an ordinary Thursday morning with Earl's coffee going cold in front of him and Pete's plate scraped clean, was that for the first time in a long while, she had something of her own again. Not something she needed her children's approval or attention to hold on to. Something Elias Kessler had left buried for 60 years, waiting for exactly this moment, exactly this version of her, to come find it. The quiet title filing hit one small complication in late March, a complication that cost Nora 2 additional weeks of waiting, and a genuine spike of worry she hadn't expected to feel. Patricia Ford called on a Monday afternoon, her usually brisk voice carrying a note of careful caution. "Mrs. Kessler, I want you to hear this from me directly, before any rumours reach you second-hand. A distant cousin of Elias Kessler's, a man named Cornelius Kessler, living in South Carolina, has filed a notice of interest in the parcel. He's claiming a possible collateral heir's stake, on the theory that if Walter's line hadn't survived to inherit, the property might have passed to Elias's siblings' descendants instead." Nora felt her stomach drop. The careful, hard-won steadiness of the last 2 months wavering slightly. Is that a real claim, Patricia? Something that could actually take this away? It's a real filing, Patricia said. Whether it's a real claim is a different question entirely. Walter was Elias's son. Elias's line survived intact through him, and then through you as his surviving spouse. Collateral heirs only have standing if the direct line failed completely. That it didn't. I believe this filing is more of an opportunistic long shot than anything with genuine legal weight. But it does mean the court will need to formally address it before finalising the quiet title action. That could add several weeks to the process. Weeks, Nora repeated, thinking of the folder already prepared on her kitchen table, the Saturday conversation she'd been quietly planning in her mind for days. I know the timing is frustrating, but I'd rather slow down and finish this properly than rush and leave any ambiguity for someone to exploit later. I promise you, Mrs. Kessler, this is a weak claim. I've handled dozens of these opportunistic filings over the years. Most withdraw once they realise how thin their legal ground actually is. Nora hung up the phone that afternoon and sat a long while at her kitchen table. The manila envelope was open in front of her, the same old survey and deed and notes spread out under the lamp. She thought of Cornelius Kessler, a man she'd never met, a stranger somewhere in South Carolina, who'd apparently heard, through whatever distant family grapevine still connected the Kessler name, across states and generations, that there was money at stake. He had decided, without ever once setting foot in Millhaven Ridge or eating a single meal at the diner's counter, that he had some claim to it. She called Earl that evening, needing, more than she wanted to admit, the steadiness of someone who'd walked this whole path alongside her from the very beginning. It's a nuisance filing, Nora, Earl told her after she'd explained it. I've seen it happen with old rural land before. Somebody hears there's value surfacing and decides it's worth a long-shot legal filing just in case it sticks. Patricia's right not to worry too much. But I understand why it rattles you all the same. I keep thinking about Elias's note, Nora said. Whoever runs this place with their whole heart will find it when the time is right. It feels almost cruel, some stranger from South Carolina trying to take that away on a technicality. He's never once lifted a finger for this place in his entire life. Then don't let him take it, Earl said simply. Let Patricia do her work. Let the facts speak for themselves. You've already done everything Elias could have possibly asked of you. A distant cousin's opportunistic filing doesn't change a single thing about that. Cornelius Kessler's claim was formally withdrawn 11 days later. Patricia's office sent a detailed response outlining the clear line of succession from Elias through Walter and finally to Nora. It came with a polite but firm note, observing that pursuing the matter further would likely result in the court assessing legal costs against him for a frivolous filing. Nora received the news by phone on a rainy Thursday afternoon, felt for the first time in nearly 2 weeks the tight knot in her chest finally loosen. It's over, Patricia told her. Truly over this time. The court's cleared the way. We should have final confirmation within the week. Patricia Ford called again on a bright Tuesday morning in April, 5 weeks after the initial filing, her voice carrying the particular brisk satisfaction of a job well finished. Mrs. Kessler, the quiet title action has been granted. Parcel B is now recorded, clean and clear, in your name alone. Congratulations. It's officially, legally, entirely yours. Nora stood at the diner's counter, phone pressed to her ear, looked out at the gravel lot, at the mechanic's bay, at the storage room door behind which a 60-year-old secret had finally come fully into the light. Thank you, Patricia, she said. I believe it's time I let my children know. She called Deborah first that same evening and asked her to come by the diner the following Saturday, along with her brothers, for what Nora described only as something about the estate that needs settling properly. Is everything all right, Mom? Deborah asked, a note of wariness creeping into her voice. You're not sick, are you? I'm perfectly healthy, Deborah. This isn't that kind of conversation. Then what kind of conversation is it? The kind that's easier to have altogether, in person, than 3 separate times over the phone. Nora said, Saturday, 10 in the morning, before the breakfast rush gets heavy. I'd appreciate all 3 of you there. Deborah called her brothers, and by the end of the week, all 3 had confirmed, arriving in Millhaven Ridge from their separate corners of the state, with the particular mixture of curiosity and mild irritation people carry when a parent asks for something without fully explaining why. Nora spent that week preparing the diner in small, careful ways she didn't fully examine the reasoning behind until later. She had Ruthie polish the counter until it gleamed under the fluorescent lights. She dusted the framed photograph near the register, the one of Walter and Elias standing beside the old gas pumps. That she'd had reprinted and framed the week after finding it in the ledger's back pages. She set the manila envelope, the survey, the deed, the ledgers, and Elias's handwritten note, all together in a single folder, organised the way Patricia Ford had shown her, ready to be handed across a counter to 3 children who had no idea what was coming. She also called Earl. "Would you be willing to be there Saturday morning?" "When I tell them." "I wouldn't miss it, Nora. Wild horses. I'd like you to explain the legal side. I can tell the story well enough, but I want them to hear the facts from someone who isn't their mother, someone who can't be dismissed as sentimental or confused." "Nobody who's ever met you for 5 minutes would call you confused, Nora Kessler," Earl said. "But I understand the instinct. I'll be there. 9:45, so we've got a few minutes to settle before they arrive." The night before, unable to sleep, Nora sat alone at her kitchen table with the manila envelope open in front of her, reading Elias's note one more time by lamplight, the same way she'd read it that first evening beneath the diner. Whoever runs this place with their whole heart will find it when the time is right. Not before. She thought about her own mother, gone now nearly 20 years, a woman who'd raised Nora on a tobacco farm 2 counties over, and had taught her, without ever quite saying so directly, that dignity wasn't something other people handed you. It was something you built, quietly, morning after morning, whether or not anyone noticed you doing it. She thought about the particular sting of that afternoon in Hollis's office, the folder closing with its small, decisive snap, the specific carelessness in Gary's voice when he'd said nobody else wanted the diner anyway. She had not been angry that day, not exactly. She had been something closer to lonely, the particular loneliness of realizing that the people who knew you best sometimes see you least clearly, blinded by old assumptions about what a mother is supposed to need once her children are grown. Ruthie called her that same evening, unprompted, sensing perhaps that Nora might need the company even from a distance. "You nervous about tomorrow?" Ruthie asked. "A little," Nora admitted. "Not about the facts of it. Earl's got those well in hand. I'm nervous about what it means for how my children see me afterward, whether it changes things for the better or just gives them a new reason to feel guilty, without actually changing how they treat me day to day. Nora Kessler, you've spent 50 years worrying more about other people's feelings than your own comfort," Ruthie said. "Maybe it's all right if tomorrow's just about the truth landing exactly where it needs to land. Whatever they do with it, after that is on them, not on you." "When did you get so wise, Ruthie?" 11 years of watching you run this place taught me plenty," Ruthie said. "You want me there tomorrow? Moral support, if nothing else." "I'd like that," Nora said. "I'd like a friendly face in the kitchen, even if you're not sitting at the table with us. I'll be there before you even unlock the front door." After Ruthie's call, Nora sat alone at the kitchen table a while longer, the old ledgers stacked beside Elias's note. Let herself think properly about Walter for the first time in weeks without the immediate business of grief or paperwork crowding in around the memory. She thought of him young, 23 years old, already steady in a way most young men weren't, standing behind the diner's counter his own father had built, taking orders with the same unhurried patience. She'd later watch that same patience carry him through raising 3 children, burying his own parents, and eventually dying quietly at that same counter 40 years later. She thought of the small ways he'd shown love without ever quite saying the word aloud, fixing the truck's brakes before she noticed they needed fixing, remembering exactly how she took her coffee, even after 50 years should have made it unremarkable, standing at the stove some Sunday mornings just to give her the rare gift of sleeping in. She wondered, turning the last ledger page over slowly under the lamp, whether Walter had ever suspected what his own father had buried beneath the storage room floor. She thought probably not. Elias's note had been specific. Whoever runs this place with their whole heart will find it when the time is right, not before. Perhaps Walter's time simply never came, 40 years of steady, faithful work notwithstanding, because the note had never been written for him at all. Perhaps it had been waiting, all along, patient as the cellar's stone walls for her. She did not know if that thought comforted her or unsettled her slightly. The idea that a man dead 30 years before she'd properly understood his handwriting had somehow anticipated a version of the family that included her, specifically, at exactly this moment in her life. But she let the thought settle regardless, the way she'd learned to let most difficult, uncertain things settle over 74 years, without needing to resolve them fully before moving forward. Nora slept better that night than she'd expected to, the old note folded carefully back into its envelope on her nightstand. She woke the next morning at 3:30, a full 15 minutes before her usual alarm, already feeling the particular clear-headed calm of a woman who has spent a long time preparing for a moment, and has finally arrived at it. Saturday morning came clear and cold, the last real cold snap of the season before spring settled in properly over the Blue Ridge foothills. Nora was at the diner by 3:45, as always, running the ordinary rhythm of griddle and coffee and regulars filtering in for their usual orders. Still, her hands, she noticed, were steadier than her heart that morning. Earl arrived at 9:45 sharp, folder under his arm, wearing his good coat instead of his usual work clothes. Nora understood without being told that he'd dressed for the occasion the same careful way she had, choosing her navy dress instead of her usual diner apron for the first hour of the morning. "You ready?" Earl asked, settling onto a stool near the register. "I've been ready for 6 weeks, Nora said. "I was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up to what I already knew." Deborah arrived first, a little before 10, stepping into the diner with the particular, brisk energy of a woman fitting an obligation into an already full Saturday schedule. Gary and Todd arrived within minutes of each other, Gary still checking something on his phone as he walked through the door, Todd looking mildly sheepish in the way he often did when he suspected, without quite being able to name why, that he was about to be found on the wrong side of something. "Mom," Deborah said, glancing around the mostly empty dining room, at Earl sitting quietly near the register, at the folder resting closed on the counter beside him. "What's going on? You said this was about the estate." "Sit down, all three of you," Nora said. "This won't take long, but I want your full attention while it does." They settled into the booth nearest the counter, Deborah and Todd on one side, Gary sliding in across from them, all three watching their mother with a particular wariness of adults who sense correctly that a quiet parent has been keeping something from them. "You remember the reading of your father's will?" Nora said. It wasn't a question. "Of course we remember," Gary said. "We were there, Mum. You remember what you told me, that the diner was mine because nobody else wanted it, that it was basically a write-off, that I could sell the land for whatever it was worth and rest." Deborah shifted slightly, some discomfort crossing her face. "Mum, we didn't mean it unkindly. We just thought—" "I know what you thought," Nora said evenly, without heat. "I'm not here to relitigate that conversation. I'm here to tell you what's happened since." She nodded to Earl, who opened his folder and set it on the table between them. "My name's Earl Whitcomb," he said, "Rowan County Tax Assessor. I served with your father many years ago, before any of you were born. I came out here back in February to do the annual reassessment on this property. Standard county business, nothing unusual. But in the course of that reassessment, your mother and I discovered something neither of you knew existed." He spread the old 1961 survey across the table, the diner's main lot outlined in faded blue, the second shape at the back corner marked in different ink. "This is a survey from 1961, Earl continued. "It shows a second, separate parcel of land behind the diner, running along the Coldwater Creek frontage. This parcel was never merged into the diner's main lot. It was deeded separately to your grandfather, Elias Kessler, the same year. That deed was never transferred, never sold, never formally passed down through any recorded probate." "Wait," Gary said, sitting forward. "Are you saying there's more land than what was in Dad's estate?" "I'm saying," Earl said carefully, "that this parcel was never part of your father's estate at all. It existed entirely separate from everything the three of you divided up at the reading. Nobody could have included it in that division. Because nobody, including your father, appears to have known it still existed as a separate, unmerged title." Deborah's brow furrowed. "How did you find this?" Nora answered that one herself. "I found a survey in your father's things while I was packing up the house. It led me to a sealed cellar beneath the diner's storage room floor, built by your grandfather, back when this was still a filling station. Inside was a trunk with his original service ledgers, the original 1961 deed, and a note in his own handwriting." She slid the folded note across the table and watched her children read it in silence. The lot under her feet was never the diner's to give away. Whoever runs this place with their whole heart will find it when the time is right. Not before. Todd looked up first, something complicated moving across his face. He left this for whoever kept the diner running, not for whoever inherited it on paper. That's how the county's title attorney read it too, Earl said. Under North Carolina intestate succession law, when Elias died in 1991 without a will, this parcel passed automatically to your father as his only surviving child, even though it was never formally probated at the time. When your father passed, since this parcel was never merged with the diner's recorded lot and never appeared in any estate inventory, it wasn't something that could be included in the will's division. It sat, legally speaking, entirely outside everything the three of you split. So it went to Mom, Gary said slowly, understanding arriving in his voice like weather changing. It went to your mother, Earl confirmed, as Walter's surviving spouse, and as the one who's been actively running this property this entire time. The county completed a quiet title action 5 weeks ago. It's fully hers now, clean and clear, no ambiguity remaining. The dining room went quiet, the ordinary sounds of the diner, the hum of the coffee machine, the distant clatter of Ruthie in the kitchen, filling the silence where none of the three siblings had quite found their next words yet. Todd reached for the old note again, reading it a second time, his lips moving slightly over the words the way people read something they want to make sure they haven't misunderstood. Grandpa Elias never even lived to see any of us born, he said quietly. He wrote this not knowing who'd end up finding it. He just trusted that whoever did would be the right person. That's a strange kind of faith to have in somebody you'll never meet, Deborah said. Is it? Nora asked. Or is it just faith in the idea that the work itself would eventually reveal who deserved to inherit it? Not the name on a will. The person still standing here, still doing the work. The truth finally had room to surface. Gary sat with that a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. Nora watched something shift behind his eyes, some careful recalculation of a story he'd apparently told himself for years about his own family's history. I always thought Grandpa Elias was just a guy who ran a gas station, Gary said finally. Dad barely talked about him. I never really thought there was much more to know. There's always more to know about the people who came before us, Nora said. Most of us just don't bother looking until something forces us to. The silence that followed carried a different weight than the one before it. Less shock now, more the quiet work of three grown adults recalculating something they'd assumed was settled, and finding it considerably less settled than they'd believed. How much, Gary said finally, is the land actually worth? Gary, Deborah said, a warning edge in her voice. It's a fair question, Gary said, not unkindly, just direct in the way he'd always been direct. If this is real, if it's Mom's, I want to understand the full picture. That's all. Earl glanced at Nora, who nodded once, giving him permission to continue. The county's been quietly rezoning a stretch of the Coldwater Creek corridor for small commercial use, Earl said. Your mother's parcel sits directly within that rezoned stretch. 1/4 acre prime creek frontage. Based on recent comparable sales along that corridor, conservatively, we're looking at a value somewhere north of $210,000, possibly higher, depending on how the commercial development plays out over the next few years. Todd let out a low breath. Deborah's hand went briefly to her mouth. Gary sat back in the booth, doing some visible math behind his eyes. That's more than the house sold for, Todd said quietly. More than all three of our shares combined. It is, Earl said simply. Nora watched her children absorb that number, watched the particular arithmetic of guilt and surprise move across each of their faces in turn. Deborah looked, more than anything, ashamed, the same look she'd worn as a teenager caught in a small, unnecessary lie. Todd looked mostly stunned, still working through the strangeness of a grandfather he'd barely known having quietly shaped this outcome, 60 years before any of them were born. Gary's face was harder to read, a careful blankness Nora recognized from his father, the particular way Kessler men held their reactions close, until they'd finished thinking them through completely. Mom, Deborah said finally, her voice smaller than Nora had heard it in years. We didn't know about any of this. If you had known what? Nora said, still without heat, Still, something in her tone had sharpened just slightly, the way a knife sharpens without ever needing to be raised. Would you have divided things differently? Given me a bigger share of the house out of guilt instead of handing me the diner because nobody else wanted it? Deborah had no answer for that. Nobody did. I want to be clear about something. Nora continued, looking at each of her 3 children in turn. I'm not telling you this to punish you or to make you feel small. I'm telling you because it's the truth. Because your grandfather went to considerable trouble 60 years ago to make sure the truth eventually surfaced. But I want you to understand something else too. This isn't a windfall I'm going to share back out 3 ways, the way you divided your father's estate. Gary's jaw tightened slightly. Mom, we're not asking... I know you're not asking, Gary. I'm telling you before you have the chance to consider asking. This parcel is mine. It came to me through your grandfather's foresight and your father's quiet inheritance, and my own choice, every single day for the last 6 months, to keep this diner's lights on when everyone else assumed it wasn't worth the trouble. I earned whatever comes of this land the same way I've earned everything else in my life. One morning at a time. Silence again, though a different quality of silence this time, something closer to reckoning than surprise. What are you going to do with it? Todd asked eventually. Quiet, genuinely curious rather than calculating. I'm going to build a deck, Nora said, out over the creek frontage, somewhere your father's regulars can sit on a summer evening and watch the water go by, somewhere your grandfather's old filling station customers would have recognized if any of them were still around to see it. That's it? Gary asked, something almost like disbelief in his voice. You're not going to sell it? $200,000 and you want to build a deck? I might sell a portion of it eventually, Nora said. I might not. That's my decision to make. Same as the house on Larkin Street was yours and your siblings' decision to make. I didn't argue with how quickly you 3 moved to sell that. But right now, today, what I want is exactly what I said. A place for people to sit and eat and watch the water. Same as your grandfather probably imagined when he first cleared that plot back in 1961 and never got the chance to build on it himself. Deborah wiped at her eyes, quick and embarrassed, the way people do when they're caught by feeling more than they expected to feel. Mom, I'm sorry, she said, for what I said at the reading, about you just resting. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, but I understand now how it must have landed. I know you didn't mean it cruelly, Deborah, Nora said, her voice softening slightly for the first time since the conversation began. None of you did. You've all just gotten used to thinking of me as someone whose life is mostly finished. Someone who's done the hard part and just needs to be taken care of, gently from here on out. I understand why you'd think that. I'm 74 years old, and I just buried your father. But you're not finished, Todd said slowly, like the realization was arriving in real time. No, Nora said. I'm not even close to finished. The meeting ended more quietly than it began, Deborah hugging her mother a long moment at the door, in a way that felt more honest than any hug they'd shared since the funeral. Todd shaking Earl's hand and thanking him for his trouble. Gary lingering last, checking his phone again. Still, something in his posture had shifted, some of the brisk certainty from earlier gone soft around the edges. Mom, Gary said at the door, I want to come back out sometime soon. Not about the land, just to eat breakfast. It's been a while since I sat at this counter for anything other than settling business. I'd like that, Gary, Nora said, and meant it. She thought the matter was largely settled after that Saturday. The truth delivered. The reckoning absorbed. The ordinary business of running a diner ready to resume its steady rhythm. But 3 weeks later, on a grey Tuesday afternoon during the diner's slow hour, a car she didn't recognise pulled into the gravel lot. A man in a grey suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase that looked entirely out of place against the diner's faded red roof. He introduced himself as Marcus Doyle, representing a regional development firm called Crestline Partners, and he wasted little time getting to his point. Mrs. Kessler, we've been tracking the Coldwater Creek corridor rezoning closely, he said, settling uninvited onto a stool at the counter. Our firm is interested in acquiring several parcels along that stretch for a planned mixed-use development. We understand you recently secured clean title to a 1/4-acre parcel adjacent to your diner. Word travels fast in a county records office, Nora said evenly, pouring him coffee he hadn't asked for, but didn't refuse either. County filings are public record, Mrs. Kessler. were simply diligent about tracking opportunities. He named a figure, considerably higher than Earl's earlier estimate, sliding a business card across the counter alongside it. We'd want to move quickly. Properties like yours don't stay quiet for long, once word gets out about the rezoning. Nora looked at the card, at the figure. At the confident, unhurried way Marcus Doyle sipped his coffee, like a man accustomed to getting what he came for. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Doyle, but I'm not interested in selling. Mrs. Kessler, with respect, that's a substantial sum for a parcel you weren't even aware you owned 2 months ago. I'd encourage you to at least discuss it with your family before dismissing it outright. I have discussed it with my family, Nora said. This past Saturday, in fact, right here at this counter. My decision hasn't changed since then. I don't expect it to change based on an unannounced visit from a stranger with a business card. Doyle's easy confidence flickered slightly, recalibrating. Perhaps I could speak with your children directly. Sometimes these decisions benefit from a family conversation, with all parties informed. My children are not parties to this decision, Mr. Doyle. The land is mine, clean and clear. I'll thank you to respect that the same way the county already has. He left eventually, business card still sitting on the counter where Nora had left it untouched. She thought little more of the encounter until Deborah called 2 days later, her voice tight with something between confusion and concern. Mom, a man named Marcus Doyle called me. Said he represents a development firm interested in the Creek property. He implied you might be open to selling if the family encouraged it. Is that true? Nora felt something cold and steady settle into her chest. The particular clarity that comes with recognizing exactly what kind of pressure is being applied and exactly how to answer it. That is not true, Deborah. I told him myself in person that I wasn't interested in selling. He apparently didn't care for that answer and decided to try a different angle. He made it sound like it was already mostly decided, like he just needed the family on board to move things along. He's a salesman, Deborah. Salesmen say, whatever moves the sale forward. I'd appreciate it if you and your brothers told him the same thing I told him, if he calls again. The land isn't for sale. It isn't a family decision. It's mine. There was a pause on the line, and when Deborah spoke again, her voice had steadied into something firmer, something that sounded, for the first time in longer than Nora could remember, like her daughter standing fully on her mother's side of a line, rather than somewhere uncertain in the middle. I'll tell him, Mum, and I'll tell Gary and Todd too, in case he tries them next. Thank you, Deborah. Mum, Deborah added before hanging up, I've been thinking about what you said Saturday, about us thinking your life was mostly finished. I've been sitting with that all week. I don't like how true it feels. Nora let that sit a moment, the phone warm against her ear, the diner quiet around her in the slow grey afternoon. Then don't sit with it too long, Deborah, she said gently. Sitting with guilt doesn't build anything. Doing something different does. Todd called that same week, his voice carrying an edge of protective anger Nora hadn't heard from her youngest son in years. That Doyle guy called me too, Mum. Tried the same angle he tried with Deborah, hinting the family might want to encourage you to sell. I told him flat out the family's not in the business of encouraging you to do anything you haven't already decided for yourself. Thank you, Todd. I mean it, Mum. I don't like the idea of some stranger in a suit trying to talk you out of something that's rightfully yours, especially by working around you through us. Grandpa Elias buried that deed for 60 years so it'd land with the right person. Feels wrong letting some developer undo that with a phone call. It won't be undone, Todd. Not by him. Gary's version of the same conversation, when Doyle inevitably reached him a few days later, was shorter and considerably more direct, delivered with the particular bluntness Gary brought to any negotiation he considered settled before it started. Mr. Doyle, Gary told him, as he later recounted to Nora with something close to satisfaction in his voice. My mother has made her decision. My siblings and I support it completely. I'd appreciate you not calling this family again about that parcel. You said that? Nora asked when Gary relayed the exchange over the phone that evening. Word for word, Mom. Felt good to say it honestly. First time in longer than I'd like to admit that I've stood up for something without doing the math on it first. Nora carried that phone call with her for days afterward. She turned it over the way she'd once turned over Elias's old survey under the lamp. She was surprised at how much weight a few plain sentences from her eldest son could carry, once they finally arrived without hesitation or calculation attached to them. Marcus Doyle called twice more over the following 2 weeks, his tone shifting gradually from confident to faintly desperate, as each of Nora's children, one by one, echoed the same firm refusal back to him. He mentioned on his final call that Cressline Partners would be moving forward with other parcels along the corridor instead, a thinly veiled attempt at urgency that Nora recognised for exactly what it was and declined to respond to with anything beyond a polite final goodbye. She hung up the phone that last time and stood a moment in the quiet diner, feeling something settle fully into place that had been slowly gathering since the day Earl first frowned down at his tablet behind the mechanic's bay. The land was hers. Her children, however imperfectly, had stood beside her when a stranger tried to pressure them into pressuring her. And the 60-year-old note Elias Kessler had left, folded inside a rusted trunk, had finally fully done exactly what he'd intended it to do. Whoever runs this place with their whole heart will find it when the time is right. She had found it, and she had kept it. Spring arrived properly in Millhaven Ridge by late April. The Blue Ridge foothills, going green and loud with birdsong, Coldwater Creek running high and clear with snowmelt from higher elevations. Nora spent those weeks in the particular, busy contentment of a woman with a plan, meeting with a local contractor named Sam Okafor, who'd grown up 2 towns over, and remembered eating breakfast at Kessler's as a boy, back when his own father used to bring him in on Saturday mornings before Little League games. "I'd be honoured to build this deck for you, Mrs. Kessler," Sam said, walking the creek frontage with her one bright morning, sketching rough plans onto a yellow legal pad. "My dad talked about this diner right up until he passed. Said your husband made the best hash browns in the county, and never once raised the price past what a working man could afford. Walter always said a diner that prices out its regulars isn't a diner anymore," Nora said. "Just a restaurant pretending." Sam laughed at that, the easy laugh of a man who understood exactly the distinction being drawn. "I like that. I'm going to remember that." Construction began in early May, the sound of saws and hammers filling the gravel lot through the slow midday hours. Nora watched from the diner's back window as the deck's frame slowly took shape over the creek frontage her father-in-law had quietly protected 60 years earlier. She thought of him often during those weeks, a man she'd never met, whose careful, deliberate handwriting she now recognised on sight, whose steady eyes she saw echoed in Walter's old photographs and she suspected in her own children's eyes too. They weren't busy arguing about lake houses and inheritance shares. Earl came by most Thursdays, ostensibly to check on the deck's progress from a county code perspective, though Nora suspected, never quite said aloud, that he'd simply grown fond of the diner's rhythm again after all these years, fond of Pete Ambrose's dry jokes and Ruthie's careful coffee, and the particular comfort of a place that had known his old friend Walter for 4 decades. "You've done something remarkable here, Nora," Earl told her one Thursday, watching Sam's crew set the deck's final support posts into the creek bank. "Not just finding the land, building something worth building on it. I had a lot of help," Nora said. "Yours especially." "I just noticed a mismatched survey line, Nora. You're the one who decided what to do about it." Deborah visited twice during those weeks. Once alone, once with her own 2 teenage children in tow. She introduced them properly to the diner and its history. Nora realised with a small pang it was nearly the first time either child had shown much interest in their grandfather's business beyond the obligatory holiday visit. "Grandma," Deborah's daughter Claire asked, standing at the storage room door, peering down the stairwell that Nora had left accessible, with a sturdy new railing Sam's crew had installed. "Did you really find buried treasure under here?" "Not treasure exactly," Nora said, smiling. "Just the truth. Sometimes that's worth more." "That's basically the same thing," Claire said, with the confident logic of a 14-year-old. Nora found herself laughing. A real laugh, the first one that had come easily since Walter's death. Todd stopped by more frequently than either of his siblings, often on his way home from work, sitting at the counter for a quiet cup of coffee and a slice of pie, saying little but staying longer than the coffee alone required. Nora recognised in her youngest son a particular kind of quiet reckoning, the same one Deborah had voiced aloud on the phone weeks earlier, working itself out slowly in silence rather than words. "You know," Todd said, "one such evening, watching the last of Sam's crew pack up their tools for the day, Dad used to bring me out here on Sunday mornings, just the 2 of us, before I was old enough to really help in the kitchen. I'd sit right there." He pointed to the second stool from the end. "He'd let me have a cup of coffee, mostly milk and sugar, Tell me stories about his own dad building the gas station from nothing. I didn't know that, Nora said softly. I forgot it myself mostly, until all this happened, Todd admitted. Funny how finding something old can shake loose a memory you didn't even know you'd buried. Gary's reckoning came slower and quieter, though it came. He called one evening in late May, his voice carrying none of its usual brisk efficiency. Mom, I've been thinking about something you said, about earning things one morning at a time. I think I've spent so long measuring success by the numbers on a spreadsheet that I forgot there's a difference between what something's worth and what it actually means. That's a big realization for a Tuesday phone call, Gary. I've had a few weeks to sit with it, he said, something almost sheepish in his tone. I'd like to come out for the Dex opening, if there's going to be one. Bring my kids too. I want them to understand where this family actually comes from. Not just the version I've been telling them, which mostly starts and ends with the house on Larkin Street. I'd like that very much, Gary, Nora said. Felt something in her chest ease slightly further, a small additional thread of the old ache finally loosening. The Dex grand opening, if it could be called that, happened on a warm Saturday evening in early June. String lights strung along the new railing. Sam Okafor's crew invited back, as guests of honour. Pete Ambrose holding court at the Dex far corner, with a plate of ribs Ruthie had spent all afternoon smoking on Walter's old grill. Deborah's children ran along the creek bank, shoes off, laughing at something only teenagers find funny. Todd sat quietly beside his mother, watching the water. Gary arrived a little late, his own 2 children in tow, and stood a long moment at the top of the Dex steps, looking out at the creek, at the diner behind him, at the small brass plaque Nora had commissioned and had Sam install beside the Dex entrance that very week. Kessler's, EST, 1958, built by hands that never stopped working. That's Grandpa Elias's dates, isn't it? Gary said, reading it slowly. Not Dad's diner year, Grandpa's original filling station. It felt right, Nora said. The diner's just the shape the business happened to take by the time I married into it. The heart of it started with him, 60-some years before I ever set foot on this land. Earl found her at the Dex railing a little later that evening, the sun going down gold and slow over Coldwater Creek, the water catching the string light's glow in scattered, shifting fragments. Walter would be proud of this, Earl said quietly. Both of them would. I hope so, Nora said. I never met Elias, and I lost Walter too soon to properly thank him for what he built. But I like to think they'd understand why I did this. I think they'd understand, Earl said. I think they'd also understand something else, that it wasn't really about the land at all. Nora looked at him, waiting. It was about somebody finally seeing what you were worth, Earl said simply. Elias couldn't have known it would be you, 60 years later, but he built something that only the right kind of person could ever find. Somebody who kept showing up. Somebody who never once, in 50 years, stopped believing this place. The people in it deserved her whole heart. Nora didn't answer that right away. She looked out instead at her grandchildren laughing along the creek bank, at Deborah leaning against the railing beside her own daughter, at Todd carrying an extra plate over to Pete Ambrose without being asked, at Gary crouched down beside his son, pointing out something in the water. She looked at the diner behind them all, lit warm from inside, the same diner her children had once handed her, like a leftover nobody wanted. It was never about the money, she said finally. It never once was. Summer settled over Millhaven Ridge the way it always did, slow and green and humming with insects along the creek bank. The diner's new deck quickly became exactly what Nora had imagined it could be. Regulars who'd eaten at the counter for decades started asking for deck seating instead, watching the water while they ate. Word spread slowly through the county, the way word does in small towns, until strangers passing through on Route 9 started stopping in specifically for the view as much as the food. Ruthie hired a second part-time cook to keep up with the modest increase in business, a quiet young man named Dennis who reminded Nora, in small unexpected ways, of Todd at that same age. Pete Ambrose claimed the Dex corner table as his own, with the same easy proprietorship he'd once claimed his crooked parked spots in the gravel lot. Nobody, least of all Nora, saw any reason to argue with him about it. Deborah started visiting more regularly, not just on Sundays by phone but in person, bringing Claire and her younger brother out most weekends through the summer, teaching them, gradually, the particular rhythm of a diner counter, how to pour coffee without spilling, how to read a regular's order before they'd even sat down fully. Nora found herself some mornings watching her granddaughter work the register with careful concentration, thinking that perhaps this too was part of what Elias Kessler had quietly intended all those years ago. Not just land, not just money. A thread of continuity, passed down through whoever proved willing to pick it up and carry it forward. Gary visited less often, his life in Charlotte busy in the particular way city lives stay busy. But he called more, real calls, longer than the obligatory Sunday check-ins of years past. Twice that summer he brought his own children out for a full weekend, teaching them to fish in Coldwater Creek, the way his own father had once tried and mostly failed to teach him. "I was never much good at fishing," Gary admitted, one such afternoon, watching his son cast a line clumsily into the shallows near the new deck's pilings. "Dad used to bring me out here, and I'd rather have been anywhere else. I think I finally understand why he loved it, though. It wasn't really about the fish." "No," Nora agreed. "It never was." Todd, of all her children, changed the most visibly that summer. He began coming out not just for coffee after work, but for full shifts on Saturday mornings, learning the grill the way his father had once learned it from Elias, standing over the same griddle, flipping the same eggs. Gradually, he earned back a kind of closeness to his family's history, one Nora suspected he hadn't realised. Until that summer, he'd been missing. "I might want to take this over someday," Todd told her one slow Saturday afternoon in July, wiping down the grill the way he'd watched Ruthie do it 100 times now. "Not soon, not until you're ready to slow down, whenever that is." But someday. Nora studied her youngest son a long moment, seeing in his face something of Walter's steady patience, something of Elias's careful handwriting, a thread running unbroken across 3 generations she hadn't fully appreciated until a warped storage room floor had cracked open 60 years of quiet, careful protection. "I'd like that, Todd," she said, "more than I can easily say." By August, the deck had become such a fixture of the diner's identity that Sam Okafor's crew came back to build a second, smaller extension, a covered section for rainy days. Earl Whitcomb had become such a fixture of Nora's ordinary week that nobody, not even Nora herself, quite remembered anymore a time when he hadn't stopped by most Thursdays for coffee and easy conversation. "You've built something here, Nora," Earl told her, one warm evening in late August, the two of them sitting together on the deck after closing, watching the last of the summer light fade gold over the water. "Not just the deck, the whole thing. Your kids coming back around. Todd talking about taking over someday. This town remembering why it loved this place in the first place." "I didn't build it alone," Nora said. "Elias built the foundation 60 years before I ever arrived. Walter kept it running 40 more. I just happened to be the one standing here when it was finally time for the rest of it to surface." "Maybe," Earl said. "But foundations only matter if somebody's still willing to build on top of them. Plenty of people would have sold that land the moment they found out what it was worth. You built a deck instead. That's not an accident of timing, Nora. That's character." Nora considered that a long moment, watching the creek run steady and quiet past the piling Sam's crew had set that spring. Watching the string lights come on automatically as the evening dimmed, casting their familiar warm glow across a stretch of water that had waited 60 patient years to be properly seen. "I suppose it is," she said finally. "But I didn't do it to prove anything to anyone. I did it because it felt like the truest thing I could do with what I'd been given." 1 year to the day after Walter's funeral, Nora stood on that same deck in the early morning quiet. Before the diner opened, before Ruthie or Dennis arrived, before Pete Ambrose claimed his corner table, she watched the sun come up slow and orange over Coldwater Creek, the water running high with the last of the season's rain. She thought about the lawyer's office a year earlier, the folder closing with its small, decisive snap. Gary's careless certainty that the diner was worth nothing more than a chore nobody wanted. She thought about the warped storage room floor, the narrow stone stairwell, the rusted trunk waiting patient in the dark for 60 years. She thought about Elias Kessler's careful handwriting, a man she'd never met who had somehow understood, decades before she was even born into this family, exactly the kind of person who would eventually need what he'd quietly protected. The lot under her feet was never the diner's to give away. She understood now fully what that meant. Not just the land, not just the money, though the money had mattered too, had built a deck and hired a second cook, and given her children something they'd been quietly craving without knowing its name. It meant something simpler and older than any of that. That the truest inheritance was never a line item on a will. It was showing up morning after morning for the people and the places that needed you, long after everyone else had decided you had nothing left worth giving. Todd had called the night before asking if he could come by that morning before his usual Saturday shift. Nora had told him yes, of course, same as she told him yes to most things these days. Watching her youngest son slowly build a life around the same counter his father and grandfather had built theirs around before him. Deborah had sent a photograph the week before of Claire, standing proud behind the register, pouring coffee for a regular, with the same careful concentration Nora remembered from her own first months learning the trade 50 years earlier. Gary had called just 2 nights ago, no business reason at all. Just to talk, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable phone call that Nora had once feared she might never get from him again. None of it had come easily, and none of it had come all at once. Grief rarely resolves itself in a single tidy season. Family rarely mends itself in a single tidy conversation, however much truth that conversation manages to carry. But something had shifted in Millhaven Ridge that year, quiet and steady, as the creek running past the diner's new deck. Nora had learned to trust that shift the same way she'd learned to trust most good things in her long life. Not because they arrived with fanfare, but because they kept showing up, morning after morning, exactly when they were needed most. She thought sometimes, in the quiet hours before the diner opened, about how close her children had come to never knowing any of it. If the storage room floor had never bowed that wet February week. If Earl Whitcomb hadn't happened to notice a mismatched survey line while doing ordinary county business. If Elias Kessler had chosen a different, less patient way to protect what he'd built. So much of what mattered most in a life, she had come to believe, hinged on small, unglamorous moments like these. A warped panel, a careful old friend, a note written 60 years before anyone needed to read it. She heard Ruthie's car pull into the gravel lot behind her, heard Pete Ambrose's truck rattle in a few minutes after that, heard the ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning assembling themselves around her, the same steady way they had every morning for 50 years. Nora Ann Kessler turned from the water, walked back inside to the griddle Walter had cleaned every night for 40 years, without fail. Lit it for another morning,